So you will send your questions, or when you want to be called upon, to one question moderator. Remember that one ahead of it, stating that you have a question. Please include your name if it is different from the identification we are seeing on the screen. Again, questions will be taken in the order received, and you will be asked to unmute when it is your turn. Please limit yourself to one question for the discussion. There's no time limit, but as the moderator, I will keep eye on that. Keep this flow going here this morning. If you have additional questions, put them in reserve. We will call upon you if there is time. This is a 90-minute session. We want to thank our good friends at CATS Television, Community Access Television, for recording this session. Any of your questions constitutes permission to be recorded by the team at CATS. We can stop sharing the screen. So now let's start with our opening remarks. Good morning, Senator Yoder. You want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much to everyone joining the call and to our sponsors. I appreciate your welcome, Christopher. I'm Senator Yoder, and I have the honor and privilege of serving Senate District 40. I also am privileged to be able to lead the Senate Democratic Caucus in the Senate and then at the State House. We entered this session, or the Senate Dems and I entered the session with the end goal of improving the lives of Hoosiers. I would think that anyone who enters the legislative session any year would hope that that would be that their main goal is to improve the lives of Hoosiers. And I had some priorities personally, and also as our caucus had some priorities personally. Some of the bills that I filed, one is continuing to make its way through. It's got a hearing on Tuesday morning. It's Senate Bill 176, and it is going to help get LPNs into practice a little bit quicker than what currently is taking place. We had an issue with Indiana statute. We created a pathway for high school students to be able to take courses to earn their LPN. However, the language in the law said that someone couldn't get their LPN or couldn't begin earning credit for their LPN until after they were 18 and received their high school diploma. So these students were having to retake these same courses that they were taking in high school. So we're fixing that in statute. It gets a hearing on Tuesday morning, and I'm excited about that. And would just ask you to send a little note to your representatives in the House, because that's where they're hearing it in the House. It already made it through the Senate unanimously, but now it's working its way through the House. Let them know Senate Bill 176 is the bill number and sort of the idea behind that bill. Another bill that I filed this session, which got amended into another bill, is Senate Bill 326. And this came out of a conversation I had with a police officer who lives in my district and serves in the sex crimes unit of another police department. And he said that more and more states are changing the way they frame up the crime of child pornography. And they are not using that term, and they're using child sex abuse material. And having more conversations about this and doing some research, I learned a lot and filed a bill to change that throughout Indiana code, and it went through the Senate, and it is now making its way through the House, and that bill is Senate Bill 326. Also doing some work in the space of childcare. That seems to be a really, it's at crisis mode in many of our counties throughout Indiana. And that bill is Senate Bill 423, and it is going to get a hearing this next week in the House. And it allows the state of Indiana to look at, in our child care licensed facilities, those that take any federal funding that are heavily regulated, it allows the state to look at surrounding states on their child to provider ratio. And if there are ways that we can adjust that, the way that we currently have those ratios, it impedes a community's ability to have others to increase those numbers. So we want to do this without jeopardizing any quality of care. And this bill would just allow the state to look at what other states are doing and make some recommendations and some changes in that space. So that's 423. Overall, we're still very concerned about Senate Bill 1. It did receive a hearing in the House, and you can hear from Matt, Representative Pierce in a moment, but I think Senate Bill 1 and Senate Bill 518 were heard in Ways and Means on the same day, and I think it was 9 hours of testimony that you all showed up and let us know what you think about Senate Bill 1. And by and large, for Senate Bill 1, there is real concern of the way in which Senate Bill 1 is going to impact our local units of government, being able to provide police, fire, our libraries, funding to schools. And the bill's intent was to provide relief in property taxes to homeowners, which we have heard that many homeowners, when everything else is going up, and the governor said our wages in Indiana are not going up, Hoosiers are feeling very strapped and cash poor. So Senate Bill 1 was intended to address that. However, Senate Bill 1 is property taxes, and some would say, looking at the fiscal analysis of this, it's going to have an average savings for Hoosier family property taxes of about $48 per Hoosier. And the cost, though, of what local governments are going to have to change the way that they provide services, it's going to be much more costly for local governments, and they're going to most likely have to raise local taxes to account for the loss of revenue of property taxes, in the end actually costing Hoosiers more. So while the intent was good to provide some relief when wages are not keeping up, maybe we should talk about that, but the way in which we're going about providing that relief to Hoosiers is what I'm concerned about, and many very misguided. And local leaders came out in droves, Hoosiers came out in droves and testified. 518 actually is similar, but very important difference. It's going to take those property tax dollars and require every school within a district to share those property tax dollars with all schools, including public schools and charter schools. So less funding for more schools. And it's, it has created this sort of fight between traditional public schools and charter schools, when in fact, it's just less money all the way around. We should all be joining forces and saying Senate Bill 518 is a defunding of education in Indiana in hopes of moving us further along in privatization of education in the state. So that is of deep concern, is Senate Bill 518, and it also received hours of testimony in the House. So we are watching a few bills. I will just conclude my opening remarks to say thank you for staying engaged. Thank you for communicating with my office on bills that you're seeing that you're concerned about, on the bills I've mentioned and others. But it means so much to me that I hear from you and that you are reaching out and staying engaged. So stay engaged. And with that, I'll pass it off to Representative Pierce. Thank you so much for being here.
Good morning, Representative Pierce. You want to give your opening remarks?
Okay. Yeah, so I feel like this, first of all, just to kind of give you a schedule update. So we are in the second half of the session. So the House is now considering Senate bills that have passed, and the Senate is considering the House bills that were passed over to it. And that will happen on the House side anyway. Sometimes the Senate dates are a little bit different than the House, but this is the basic kind of timeline. So the deadline for any Senate bills to be out of committee in the House is April 10th. So we've got about a month here, and then April 14th is the deadline for any bills passed out of committee to get past the second reading or amendment stage. And then April 15th is the third reading deadline, the final passage deadline for any Senate bill to get out of the House. And so between now and April 15, it'll be a lot of committee work and voting on the floor on amendments and final passage of bills. From April 16th through around the 24th, we'll say, is conference committees. And so that's where when bills are returned to the first House with amendments, the author of the bill can decide whether they want to just concur or accept the changes from the Senate, and then the full House and the Senate, or the House would vote on that for House bills. If the author of the bill decides that they're not happy with the changes made over in the Senate, they can basically dissent and call for a conference committee. And then 4 members are appointed from each, 1 member from each caucus, total of 4. So you have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans to start. And they're supposed to hammer out some kind of compromise if they can get to it. If they are able to compromise, then a committee report is generated and both the House and the Senate have to vote on that. And then that would be the final version of the bill that would go to the governor for his consideration. Now, one thing that's interesting about that sounds very nice and bipartisan. Everybody involved have to get compromised from all the different caucuses. But in reality, what happens is on these more controversial bills where you can't find a consensus, the majority party just removes the minority party members and replaces them with majority party members. So you can always kind of tell which bills are partisan by just looking at who are the conferees. If you see a conference committee report with all 4 Republicans, all 4 majority party members on it, you'll know the minority party wasn't able to get to a compromise on that. So right now, the target, I believe, is to get the session all completed by April 24th. By law, we have to be done by April 29th. So there's wiggle room in there. Sometimes they'll even finish a day or 2 early to show how efficient we all are in the legislature. If the budget gets really hung up and tough, the final budget forecast is going to come in toward the end of April. And if they say, oh, there's going to be even less money now because of all the chaotic stuff happening on the federal level, you know, that could really cause the budget people to have to go back and spin their wheels for a while. So not exactly sure exactly when it is going to end, but right now the goal, I guess, is April 24th. So that's kind of the timeline schedule. For the second half in the House, for me, it seems like it's all about the money, right? So the budget is over in the Senate, so the Senate will be dealing with the budget side. I'm not very happy with the budget because I don't think it really addresses what we need to address on healthcare, on getting Medicaid on a solid footing that can actually serve the people who need it. And then also on the school funding side, I want to point something out. So we legislators, one of the things they look for is something called a school run, which is basically like a spreadsheet kind of printout of how the budget, current state of the budget, will actually impact their own individual schools. And these school runs are run with parameters created by the Republicans who are putting the budget together. And unfortunately, the kind of the politest way I can put it is there's a lot of misleading information around school funding and these runs. So the first thing you always hear, the standard talking point from the majority party is, this is a historic budget. We have put more money into K-12 education than ever in the history of mankind. Aren't we great, right? Well, of course, if you even remotely keep up with education or with inflation, that's going to be more for education than the year previous. So that's not really a huge talking point in my book, but you always hear that. But the real thing is, like, what is actually happening with each individual school? So you get these school runs. Now, several years ago, when the Republicans took over writing these budgets, they changed the school run to add in a bunch of line items that essentially are federal funding. So you get these Title I funds, you get their specialized programs for special kids with special needs who get money. They added that into the funding formula to pad up what the bottom line looked like. So, you know, when you do that, when you look at MCCSC and you just look at this bottom line of how much per child will the funding increase or decrease, you see that, like, oh, the first year the budget will be 3.4% increase, and the second year will be 1.6. And so you might look at that and it's like, wow, that's not too bad in a tough budget year. But the thing is, that's all federal money that really has nothing to do with the funding of it. And those line items can only be spent on those specialized kids. It's not a general amount of money. So then you have to move up to this thing called the total basic tuition support. And so you look at that and it's like 1.7% in the first year for MCCSC and minus 0.2% in the second. Now, again, you might say, well, it's a tough budget year. At least they're getting some increase in the first year. But there's also misleading data shoved into that, because what the Republicans decided to do this year to make the bottom line of tuition support look better is they added in the textbook money. So you might remember that for the longest time in Indiana, we made parents pay for textbooks and what we now call curricular materials, because I guess it's a lot of software and computer stuff. Anyway, we used to make parents pay that, and parents who couldn't afford would be chased around by debt collectors. And to the legislature's credit, a couple years back, they finally said the state should be funding the school, what we used to call school textbooks. So what they did is they basically took that money, which used to be a total separate line item, separate discussion, and they put it into the school funding formula. So it's $158 for every child. So if you take the estimated, 9,843 students for MCCSC, and you do the math on that, that's like more than $1.5 million that they've inflated the school funding formula, because that's just to pay for the textbooks. That's not paying for teachers or other things in the classroom. And so when you back out that number, that amount of money, you actually see that MCCSC is going to get less money in the first year than it's getting this year. And so the school funding formula is kind of a train wreck, but it's being described in a way that I think is trying to mislead people. And then on property tax, Senator Yoder already pointed this out. That's a little bit of a shell game, because even if they manage to get some property tax relief in there somehow, and they take it out of the hide of the local units and say, you figure out how to pay for your police and fire, it's just going to force people to raise their income taxes on that level. Same thing's happening with road funding. There's a road funding bill that's over in the Senate now. And it essentially says to local units of government, if you haven't instituted a wheel tax, you must do so if you really want to get your state money at any level. And for some of you, if you already have a wheel tax, you have to increase it even more. So I find it interesting that the majority party that spends a lot of time talking about low taxes and not taxing people, that they kind of basically have these tax coercion provisions in their bill. The other interesting thing about that road funding bill is I think it's really pushing to turn Interstate 70 into a toll road. And the argument is we can kind of soak all the trucks and cars passing through from other states and get the tolls out of them. But I'm not a big fan of toll roads, because I think that a lot of us will end up paying those tolls when we go. And that in a way, you can call it a user fee, but that's kind of a tax increase of a sort. So lots of interesting stuff going on in the money world. And I guess I'll stop now before I dominate the whole thing and take some questions.
Thank you, Representative Pierce. Senator Yoder, you have a questions for the audience, I think, that you wanted to bring up before we start hearing from our attendees.
Well, only if there are questions that attendees have put out there. But I just have a question that we're currently debating in education, and I thought it would be a good one to throw out there to the attendees. What do you think? Is there anybody else? Okay.
I have a quick question before we start with our attendees. That is Senate Bill 518, which if you go to our Advocacy Matters blog at the Bloomington Chamber, I've written a lot about. Has there been any thought, since we're kind of, you on the Democratic side are playing a little bit of defense, is to add measures to make that funding distribution, which it does to charter schools, a little bit more difficulty, with some things, some caveats like some transparency and compliance issues, that they equal the playing field to make at least it a little bit more difficult, and to give taxpayers, frankly, a feeling that we're going to have some say in where our tax dollars goes, because I don't know if the oversight, the state seems to have difficulty with that on their state funds. I don't think they're going to have our property taxes in mind the same way. So is there anything about putting in maybe a couple poison pills of some sort?
Oh, Christopher, we We offered 27 amendments on the floor. It was 4 hours of debate. We offered those amendments and many others to 518, and they were all defeated. So it was a good debate, a long debate, and we definitely tried to. They were common sense changes to that bill, actually. It was the one you mentioned and several others. But what we were able to do is we were able to, in that 4 hour attempt to amend the bill, we were able to send signals out to people that this bill is deeply flawed, and it really, sending it over to the House, got people awake. And I think you could see it in its hearing on what, I'm not sure, was it Wednesday, or I'm not sure what day it was, but it was a long committee meeting, 9 hours, that they heard those two bills. And maybe Representative Pierce can give some insight as to what he was hearing on his side. But we did try to amend it unsuccessfully, but what we were able to do was wake people up and give people talking points on what they can do on the House side.
I think that I think you'll probably see lots of amendments along those lines. I mean, one of the kind of reoccurring criticisms that we've had from the Democratic caucus is whether it's private school vouchers or charter schools, it's like you're sending tax money into these entities and you don't have any transparency or oversight, really, any significant amount. And so, particularly now, if you're going to be sharing property taxes, those schools should have to be on a more even playing field with your traditional public schools as far as the transparency and the regulations about how they spend money.
Thank you, Representative Pierce. Let's go to our attendees. We have Kelvin O'Connell has a question regarding partisan school boards, Senate Bill 287. Kelvin, are you with us? Can you unmute? Good morning.
Yeah, hi. I'm interested in SB 287 and to see what you guys think about what impacts it'll have on our local community specifically, and where you see this bill going in the future.
You want to take that one?
Which one? I mean, who do you want to start?
Either one.
Okay, well, I'll start on this bill. So it did leave the Senate. It was bipartisan opposition. And my concern is they were trying to do this on the House side. That bill died. And I think it has some momentum to actually pass, actually pass and maybe even go into law. The thing that was good about the House version was it gave folks an option. So if you wanted to declare a party, you could declare a party. But the bill that's coming from the Senate says it's a requirement. It's going to be partisan school board elections. What is interesting and frustrating, as someone who I disagree with this and oppose the bill, I would say we just heard a bill in local government that is going to remove political affiliation to appointees to an aviation board of smaller size municipalities. So the argument there was, why does an appointee, either a commissioner or a mayoral appointee to an aviation board, why does political affiliation matter? Because it's making things difficult. And I'm not going to out my colleague, but a colleague from the other side of the aisle, I heard her mutter under her breath, "Oh, but we're going to do that for school boards." So I'm concerned about it passing through the House, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Representative Pierce has to say and what he's hearing, because I'm hearing that it most likely has the support to get through this session.
Yeah, I think it's likely to pass. I mean, this is the second or third year, maybe longer, that people have been trying to get this change through. It was interesting that in the House side, they just decided to let the bill die, but I think that was a political calculation where they know that it's a controversial bill. So why vote on it more than you have to? And let's make sure the Senate bill actually passes. And if it gets over into the House, then we can pick up on that. So I do think that probably the bigger question than will it pass is what form will it pass? So will they take the Senate bill and turn it more back to that voluntary House version, or will they go with the more partisan version that came over from the Senate? So we'll just have to see. But I kind of I haven't heard any directly from people, but I just have my just kind of sensing the environment. I think it probably is likely to pass this year.
Thank you, Representative Pierce. Senator Yoder, let's go back to your questions for the audience since we don't want to miss that. We've gone through our first half hour, so do you want to ask those questions? You're on mute, Senator.
House Bill 1002, which is a priority of the House Republicans, came over to the Senate, and one of the components of this bill, which is being marketed as a deregulation of education bill, is removing a requirement not only of the education requirements for the appointee to the the State Department of Education, but it's also removing residency. And it's removing the requirement that the appointee reside in Indiana at all. I mean, not even from Indiana, but live in Indiana during their tenure in the appointment. And I'm wanted to ask, because I'm going to try to get, put in an amendment. Thumbs up if you think, actually, there is an argument to be made that why should a person's address disqualify a person from being an appointee as Secretary of Department of Education, or thumbs down that you think, no, I think during the tenure of someone serving as the Secretary of the Department of Education, they should reside in Indiana. So if you want to participate in this, I can see your thumbs up and thumbs down if you want to give it a try. So thumbs up if you think, yes, we should not require the Secretary of Education live in Indiana, or thumbs down if you think, no, we should require the person to live in Indiana if they're serving Hoosiers.
Residency requirement. Oh, I see.
Pardon?
I see some thumbs down, Senator.
I do. I see a kissy face. That's good. I like that too.
Thumbs up, thumbs down. Yeah, I got.
I love that. Thumbs down, thumbs down.
All right, well, we're doing our thumbs. Let's go to our next question. Mary Cooey, is that, I probably butchered your name. Mary, good morning. Do you want to unmute and ask a question to our representatives here today?
Mike, you did good on the name, Chris. My question is, what is the status of Senate Bill 2 related to the Healthy Indiana Plan and work requirements? Is this bill still in the Public Health Committee? And I have a second part of the question. Are there any bills related to low-income housing still in play?
Want to tackle that, part one or two? We're trying to limit it to one, Mary, but you did a good job of sneaking that second question in there. My hats off.
Thank you.
Yeah, so SB 2 still is in the Public Health Committee. I'm just kind of taking a look to see if Public Health is actually scheduled anything. I'm not seeing it yet. So yeah, so stay tuned on that. And then on the housing stuff, I'm not aware of anything other than the House did pass a bill which kind of expands an existing housing grant program for private developers, and the communities can get them if they basically reduce a lot of their planning and zoning regulations. And that's over in the Senate now, I believe, as well. And that's the only thing I know really in the area of housing that I can recall from the House side.
Senator, anything?
We authored some bills, filed some bills. They were not given a hearing. We tried to amend Senate Bill 1 to actually provide a tax credit to renters. 30% of Hoosiers are renters, and that was defeated. We have not seen any other sort of housing affordability or accessibility bills moving on the Senate side. Their big lift was all concentrated in this property tax bill of Senate Bill 1.
Thank you, Senator. I think we'll go on to our next question. Maria Douglas, you are up. Maria, you want to unmute and ask a question? Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this time, Christopher. I want to say thank you to Senator Yoder for seeing myself and my colleague at the last minute on Democracy Day. We really appreciated that time with you. And so my question is for Representative Pierce around SB 10. Hoosier Asian American Power and our Indiana Coalition partners are highly concerned and focusing on SB 10, which for everyone is the one of the more digestible points of it is that students would not be able to use their IDs to vote. We know they can't use it to register, but to identify themselves as voting. So it's just basically making things harder. There are other provisions in that, though, as well, pertaining to voter roll purging, the accessibility of registering for voting at the Department of Motor Vehicles and such. So we don't want to lose sight of those other provisions. But Representative Pierce, I'm curious about when it is scheduled, because we've heard a couple things, and kind of what your thoughts are on the progress and what best course of action. I slipped 3 questions in there, Christopher, so.
Pretty sneaky. I only counted 2, so
okay.
quicker than I am.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't, what's the election? Yep, SB 10. So that's going to be heard on Wednesday, March 12th. So coming up on Wednesday at 10:30 a.m. in room 156B. And they've got SB 10 voter registration listed on that. So, look, this has been a long, really, I think, since I guess when Trump was defeated and wouldn't admit it, we've just been laboring under this. I have to be careful. I'm going to get a little carried away here. So people who claim to be concerned about voter integrity, voter security, accurate elections and all that kind of stuff, they have all these bills which claim to be addressing those issues, but in reality, just make it harder for people to vote and will further suppress voter registration and voter turnout and make it harder for students to vote. That's just a classic situation where Republicans think that students are just a bunch of Democrats, and if they get out and vote, and I've heard some Republicans say, oh, and we know those students, they cheat, they vote twice, they vote at home and at school. So and then they have other people like, well, they shouldn't really be voting at their schools because they live somewhere else, and they don't recognize that the students live there for probably at least 9 months out of the year, maybe more. So it's just, I've got that. There are provisions to make it harder to register people and harder for people to vote. And it's frustrating, and we fight them and we point out what this is doing. And the ultimate frustration about this is we are at the bottom of the barrel for voter turnout. I mean, we barely have half the people bother to show up. And so, you get to a situation where I guess like 14% of the people voted in the primary last time around, let alone the general election. So, you can count on I noticed that all the Democrats voted no on that bill when it came through the Senate. And I think you'll see an equal kind of unanimity on the side of the House Democrats to try to block those bills or maybe get them amended to at least, limit the damage. But I just think it's a very concerted long-term strategy to manipulate the election rules in a way that are perceived to benefit the Republican Party. And I think they benefit from low voter turnout, from discouraging voter registration, and so that's what we tend to see. So that's my horrible partisan comment for the day.
Senator, do you have any? You want to take this one?
Representative Pierce did a good job of explaining it. One of the other arguments in opposition to this bill is not just the removing a college ID from being able to use that to vote, but it's the other portion of it is duplicative. So it's going to cost more, and the state already does a portion of it. And so that is another argument in opposition of the bill. But we did try to amend the bill. I have heard that it's Purdue University no longer, this is how it was phrased to me. Purdue University doesn't want to be in the voting business, and they didn't want to have students use the IDs for voting. Now, let me be clear. You cannot use your student ID to register to vote. That you cannot do that. This is just to be able to vote day of. So you've already registered, you already have proven your residency, and this is using your ID to vote. So I would ask that you continue to advocate in opposition if you're opposed to the bill, or if you support the bill, you can do that as well. But that's kind of where we are with it, and I appreciate your advocacy now that it's on the House side.
Thank you, Senator. Let's go to our next question from the attendees. Kathy Roundtree, can you unmute your mic? Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to hear from both Representative Pierce and Senator about House Bill 1004, the one about nonprofit hospitals actually behaving like nonprofits. What do you think is going to happen in the Senate? And how would you characterize the opposition to this bill? Thank you.
If Pierce could go first, I'd love a little background on how that debate took place on the floor and in preparation for when we hear it on the Senate side.
Yeah, so there's been criticism for several years, which I personally think is justified, that a lot of these nonprofit hospital conglomerates like IU Health, who have bought up all kinds of practices and hospitals, and they have this footprint that ranges from like Kokomo to Paoli, and they've built up huge reserves. And so this is like the business community particularly has criticized the hospitals for basically charging, they say, according to their studies, some of the highest rates in the country, and building up these huge multi-billion-dollar reserves. And so there's been a lot of focus on that. And so this year, what they're trying to essentially say is like, okay, if you're going to charge high rates, and the question is, how do you define that? They're kind of they're going with like Medicaid as a baseline, and I think they said if you charge more than like twice the amount, or 3 times the amount, and they went down to 2, or maybe it was 4 and went to 3. But at any rate, the idea was that if you're charging high rates, and you're not going to be, you're going to lose your tax exemption. So in other words, the basic idea is if you're going to act like a for-profit hospital and charge high rates, then we're not going to give you the tax exemption. So I voted for the bill because I support that basic idea. Now, I had some of my fellow Democrats, there were 26 people who voted no on the bill. Their concerns are that it will inadvertently harm rural hospitals, which are struggling, and they're in a different situation. They're not the big conglomerates. They're trying to keep their doors open. They don't have a big population to do lots of procedures, so it's always a struggle. So some people felt that it was going to be more difficult on them. And I can admit that there were a lot of open questions about how the thing was actually going to operate. So when you're a legislator and you face that situation, there are kind of 2 ways you can go. You can look at the bill and say, well, I support the general thrust of what the bill is, the policy it's attempting to implement, but I think it's so botched, the actual language and implementation, that there's going to be all these negative consequences, so I have to vote no. In this case, I decided to vote yes for it because I support the underlying policy, but recognizing that it needs work. And so the idea is that the Senate will continue working on the bill and probably attempt to address some of those things. In fact, on the floor of the House, the author of the bill said that he knew the bill needed more work and that had some things that weren't going to operate the way people really wanted. And so on that bill, the question is, when it comes back from the Senate, either for a concurrence vote or if a conference committee report for the bill ends up getting presented. At that point is when I'm going to really, get into every line item and then ask myself, okay, is this really advancing the policy I like in a way that is not going to inadvertently harm small hospitals or somehow make it untenable for hospitals to provide the health care that we need? So we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Great. Thank you, Representative Pierce.
Well, I really appreciate Representative Pierce giving me that background, and as I prepare for hearing the bill, and I assume it's going to come to health, I would ask that where you are with this bill, those who are attending this, let me know, reach out to me. It does sound like one of those bills that is, they're all complicated, but this one is a bit messier. So I'll be anxious to hear exactly how we need to amend it to be better and see what work we can do to get this bill in good shape for final passage.
Thank you, Senator. Let's go to our next question. Julie Hardesty, you're up. Good morning.
Good morning. My question actually is back on SB 10 and kind of sort of poking at that sentiment that seems to be coming from Purdue, saying they don't want to be in the voting business and they don't want students to use their Purdue student ID to vote. I'm kind of wondering if anyone knows, does this also mean that Purdue does not have any voting sites on campus on election day? IU's always had a voting location on campus for election day, and I'm kind of interested to know if Purdue's just like totally moving away from all of that.
Ooh, interesting question, Julie. Any of the panel know that? That's kind of a pretty specific question.
Yeah, I think that I know there was controversy last time over what Purdue was going to do on that. And I don't know if they kind of caved in and got something done, but I can tell you, I'm going to this is my day to sound really horrible and partisan. Apologize for everyone, but sometimes I think you have to call it like you see it. So you might recall that when Governor Mitch Daniels finished out his second term as governor, the board of trustees of Purdue that he appointed decided he was the perfect person to be president of Purdue. And so he took over Purdue and he reshaped Purdue into this image of this, basic conservative university that's unlike all the other horrible woke universities out there. And, to be honest with you, and so he's left, there are people still in place there that he brought in, he kind of handpicked his successor up there, but they essentially, all the bad higher education stuff seems to come out of Purdue, from there. It's really strange. I mean, their senator, instead of like supporting his faculty, he's always undermining them with stuff like SB 202 and stuff like that. So I don't know what's in the water at Purdue. I mean, there's lots of reasons to hate Purdue now beyond their basketball team. So, I just, it is very strange, but I do think that basically there's there's an attempt, I think, to brand Purdue as this kind of conservative school in the heartland, and they're just they seem to line up with a lot of Republican priorities.
Stanford of the Midwest. Senator Yoder, do you have any comments on that one before we?
I don't. I just want to say that was a comment that was sort of made in the hallway as I was asking questions about Senate Bill 10, and getting that sort of insight, it made me realize where this was coming from and that it had some real legs. This is the same, whether it's Senate Bill 10 or Senate Bill 202 from last session, or this civics education bill from this year that we were able to defeat in committee. But it was a real effort to have this national identity of who, what it means to be an American and what it means to teach civics and what civics should include and should not include. It was so prescriptive, but you were beginning sort of to, not beginning, we know that there is this attempt to really come after free speech. And sometimes it's not as obvious as a bill about free speech. But there are all these little ways that you can see it. And Senate Bill 10 is just another one of those ways to silence college students or those who are attending university.
Senator, I'm going to stick with you on a question I have about just Medicaid eligibility. I know that Senate Bill 2, there's some runaway costs there. Is there some serious conversations on some real reforms that I think would benefit the program, or anything that you want to speak to on that issue, which I know is been kind of a dark cloud when they got the bill last year, of what that is. So I don't know if you have any insights, and Representative Pierce can chime in as well.
Well, the concern about Senate Bill 2 is it's just arbitrarily saying we're going to take the HIP, the Healthy Indiana program, and reduce the numbers. You know, we have around 700,000 Hoosiers who rely on their healthcare access through Healthy Indiana's program plan, and cap that at 500,000 individuals. And now we're hearing from the feds that they're going to require Indiana to reduce that an additional 200,000 enrollees and try to get it closer to 300,000 on the Healthy Indiana plan. So these kind of arbitrary attempts really have many constituents in my district very concerned, and I'm fielding calls and having meetings, emails of people desperate. One of the issues of Senate Bill 2 is going to require an employment eligibility. And I see that this past week, Ohio has requested a waiver from the federal government to also have an employment requirement. But the challenge here is HIP is actually in those federal dollars to be enrolled in HIP, which is where Senate Bill 2 is going to arbitrarily cap enrollees. These individuals, the majority of them are employed. They are able-bodied adults who have healthcare needs that are put on Medicaid, and who I'm hearing from are individuals who want to work but have serious chronic illness, but they don't want to file for disability. So the assumption that current enrollees in HIP do not work is, I would say, is a false notion. They don't have any research or analysis that this is true. The assumption is, and this was the debate on the floor, the assumption is once we ask for a waiver that we have to require employment to receive HIP, it will automatically disqualify people, and we will get to the numbers so we don't have to arbitrarily decide who gets HIP and who doesn't. The employment requirement will take care of the cap. And my concern is most of the individuals who are currently on the Healthy Indiana's plan are ALICE individuals. These are individuals who are asset limited, income constrained, employed Hoosiers. So that is my concern. We had amendments again to address these concerns and to make Senate Bill 2 less arbitrary, but we were unsuccessful, and now it's over in the House.
Thank you, Senator.
Yeah, so on the House side, we had House Bill 10,003 or 1003, and the only thing they really talk about as far as trying to limit costs is fraud. It's kind of the waste, fraud, and abuse thing. So 1003 was larded up with all these provisions about trying to ferret out fraud and things along those lines. And I'm all for getting at fraud, but it seems like since the last election that any conversation now that surrounds spending or programs is just all about the waste, fraud, and abuse. And as everybody admits, in any program, including government programs, you probably have some waste, and you may very well have some fraud. But I think that the discussion of the topic, making that like the sole focus, you would have people believe that half the benefits are fraudulent or something. It's just like we're now seeing this drumbeat that, there's all this fraud in Social Security, so I guess it's okay to cut Social Security now because it's all full of a bunch of fraud. So your answer is like, no one has really done the hard work of figuring out how you actually reduce the healthcare increases that impact programs like Medicaid and Medicare as well. And, that gets you into a very big conversation about how does America's healthcare system, including the one in Indiana, compare to all the other nations that are out there that seem to find a way to have better health outcomes while spending a lot less money. But that requires you to take on insurance companies and a lot of other players in the system that benefit from that system. I'd say the one area where that's being done a little bit in the state legislature is they've kind of been focusing on these pharmacy benefit managers, which supposedly started out as a entity to help you get lower drug prices, but now it seems like they're just a middleman getting kickbacks and skimming money off the top as the drugs go by. So there's a little bit of effort there, but it probably needs to happen in Congress, but there needs to be just a bigger discussion once again about, how is this healthcare system working for America?
You, Representative Pierce. Let's go for our next question. Pamela Davidson, you are up. Do you have a question? Good morning.
Good morning. I'm in my car. Farmers market was lovely. Matt, that answer was just so darn good. I can't even tell you. The insurance companies and those managers have just jacked up every price for no good. No question. And the fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicare is like 3 to 5%, where in insurance companies it's like 30. Gee willikers. But my question is, has our Indiana legislature talked at all about what is happening on the federal level? Are Indiana farmers having their crops withering away in grain silos because U.S. aid is no longer buying them? How do they plant for the upcoming season? Todd Rokita is always happy to meddle in everything that he can think of. Has this warranted his attention? Because the federal level. Oh, and I also want to say IU gets so much money from FDA research grants, CDC. They have to be reeling from the effect as well. So that's what I'm wondering, the effect of national mayhem and chaos on our Indiana. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. A lot to chew on there. Who wants to take that one first?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that no, there hasn't been any discussion about federal stuff at all. On the Democratic side, we've kind of raised the issue. It's like, hey, things are going a little crazy out there in DC. And, if you just look at that continuing resolution that passed the House, it looks like, the federal money, which is half of our state spending, is really, going to take a hit. And this could be some significant problems. So maybe we need to be thinking about that. But I think that people either don't want to focus on that up there, or they just feel that it's a little too speculative right now about what's actually going to hand out. And I can just tell you that over the years, when I've talked to Republicans, and sometimes I'll just kind of look at them and say, like, well, isn't this Trump stuff getting a little nutty? And, isn't this going to be a problem? They just kind of look at me and say, like, you know what? I don't have time to focus on that. I don't pay attention to that. And so I think they just want to keep their heads down and stay out of the fray.
Senator?
I haven't heard so much about how our Indiana farmers are reacting. I mean, I was a speaker at the Small Farmers Conference, and there is concern, but I'm not hearing anything from Republican leadership. I am hearing if they put in some, if the federal government impacts our budget so significantly, will we be called back into special session to address it? And what I heard from the Senate or from the State House Republican leadership is there's not an appetite to do that, and they're not interested in a special session to address it. But who knows? That it's hard. It's a strange place at the State House right now. I'll just say that.
Thank you, Senator, or stranger place. Amy Oliver, I think you're up next. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I have been paying attention the last couple of weeks to the legislature. I've been watching live and I said, oh my gosh, I've become such a nerd. But I really want to thank both of you, because I've been watching your advocacy on the floors of the House and in the committees, particularly Education Committee. I'm a school board member. And I just really want to thank you. I know how hard it is to have your amendments, heard and just summarily dismissed, even though they're good ideas and you're trying to make those better bills. So I want you to know that we're out here watching and just really happy for your advocacy. You've already answered almost all my education questions, so thank you for that. I do just want to remind everybody that my other concern that maybe is not as prevalent as some of the others as far as the bills is issues regarding referendum and general obligation bonds and the provisions that are in there. We just did a general education bond vote this week here in Brown County because we're concerned about what will happen after April 30th and what the rules will be. So we want to make sure that they are not going to have a year, make us wait a year before we can do a new referendum or do a new general obligation bond, because that's really important for us to keep our tax rates even and to pay our staff evenly without having to have this year gap. So I think it's a political move, really, because they want tax rates to go down and then make us look bad when we try to raise them again to bring them back to where they were. But I just want to make sure that everybody's keeping an eye on that ball, in addition to all of the other property tax issues. So thank you for all your advocacy.
Thank you, Amy. Definitely, we're keeping an eye on it, and you are not alone. And your sense that this is just more, I like to say, we've moved far beyond local control, and now it's just about controlling the locals. And this is just you're identifying and speaking to ways in which they are trying to manipulate and control our local governments and especially our school boards and our local schools. So thank you for your work, and keep showing up and keep paying attention. I've been astounded. This session by far has been the one that I hear from students and grandmas and school board members, just across the gamut. So many people watching and paying attention and commenting. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that there are some members, maybe a lot of members, who think that these referendums are just passing too easily, and it's kind of frustrated them for a number of years. And so they've been, they tried to change the language in a way that would kind of skew people to vote no, kind of like taking a poll question and kind of twisting it around. So they played those games. And now, I mean, their argument is that they ought to be in a general election where a lot of people vote, but they don't account for the situation that you may have to wait several years to get to that. And in the meantime, the school may desperately need those funds. And so that's the trade-off there. But there's certainly been a trend of coming up with mechanisms to make passing referendums more difficult. And I think that might be the end desire.
I'll add one more thing, because I did think of this comment, is in 518, they have pushed the sharing of referenda dollars to 2028. There's a lot of thinking that will appease our school districts, that they have more time to prepare. But what's going to happen is when communities are taking a vote on a referendum, if it is, for example, MCCSC, where we have a strong belief in our public school system, if those voting know that, well, we're going to have to share these dollars, I'm not so keen on that, then it's not necessarily because they don't believe in public schools. They just don't like the idea of sharing the dollars. So it's going to be that much more difficult to pass these referenda throughout Indiana. It's already hard. So it's not only just a scheduling and a timing, but it's in messaging. They know that it's just one more notch against, supporting public schools. And so that's another issue to watch out for in 518.
And I would add that we would have to ask for more money. Like, if we're going to have to share it, then it isn't really a reduction in, we'd have to account for that. So to say, well, if we're going to have to share those funds, then we've got to have a different formula as how much is going to be needed. Thank you.
I have a question. Workforce development, talent, retention, attraction, coming from the chamber, this is a big issue. We somewhat in the state don't have the talent pool we'd like. What's anything on the pipeline, anything we can look at from this session that it sort of addresses our workforce?
You know, it's interesting because I don't really remember anything. And I think that probably what's going on there, as you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, there were a lot of really major workforce development bills, particularly focused in on apprenticeships and internships and kind of inventing high school, as the Speaker of the House likes to call it. And then that created a fairly controversial system of deciding how the high school diplomas were going to get, reworked. So I think that what might be going on, particularly with a new governor, is I think they might be taking a little bit of a pause on that. Now, Senator Yoder can correct me if there's something moving that I'm just slipping my mind right now, but I think they're kind of maybe laying low this year to see if they can get these new high school diploma work requirements kind of in there and functioning and see how that works out before they come back and try something new. Because the workforce development stuff they've done, they've had some problems with implementation on it, I think, where they've had to come back the next year and say, oh, we got to rework this law and do some different things. And so I think they're a little bit gun shy maybe at the moment.
Well, my Senate Bill 176 actually addresses this, but I know that we're increasing funding in 1001 for career savings accounts. I'm not somebody who thinks that's the direction we should take, but I think that there is increased funding there. We have not heard these, sort of sweeping workforce development bills that we have heard in the past. We've passed, so many of them in the last 3 years that they're trying to scramble to sort of get them in place so students will actually start using them because they just didn't have an infrastructure in place to make that happen. And now that many public schools who were responding and trying to create these pathways, whether it was, through the pathways or the apprenticeships, now that they're facing less funding, I know I met with RBB yesterday, and that's one of their concerns. They spent a lot of time and their resources creating these pathways for students, and now they're wondering, did we get it wrong? I don't know how we're going to be able to support the mental health of our students and all of these pathways that we've been encouraged by the Department of Education to create. If we have less funding, what are we going to do? So I think that is where many schools are being asked this question and applying pressure to legislators. I just would sort of put a plea out there. Legislators, I know senators, they listen to superintendents. I mean, that seems to be somebody that they listen to in these districts. So, really encourage your superintendents to begin getting active. I know they have an association, but if they can also reach out personally, that makes a big difference, because sometimes the association has to play their cards a little differently than hearing from their individual district superintendents.
So a follow-up on that, what has been the evaluation on some of these measures, these workforce, whether they put it into K-12 or some other ones that they've sort of provided businesses for training? Have we gotten any sense of any successes or anything that has not worked? Because that's one thing that we just kind of move along to the next thing. We never hear how some of those things work out in the end.
I share your frustration. I actually serve on education, and I am on the interim committee for education, and we do not hear these reports, these updates. Like, what difference are we making in the lives of Hoosiers? Are we actually getting the product that was intended with passing all of these bills? I'm not hearing those numbers. I'm sure we have a dashboard that reports something. We have lots of dashboards, death by dashboards in the state of Indiana. I'm sure there's a dashboard showing something, but I've not actually heard any discussion about it or received any report about it.
Senator, anything you want to add, Representative Pierce?
Yeah, I mean, you're actually raising a bigger issue, which is the legislature is really bad at actually going back and evaluating what it's done and seeing whether something's actually worked or not. And that can kind of be frustrating. So we just kind of deal with the, crisis of the day and then move on to the next thing. And there's not much kind of looking back unless there's just a giant train wreck. I think they kind of figure that's the executive branch's job to implement these laws and to come back if they think something needs to get fixed or is not working right. I can tell you, Washington State has an interesting situation where their legislature actually contracts with one of their universities to have basically like a think tank. And, we get these fiscal impact statements on every bill. That's a requirement. You have to estimate how much a bill is going to cost. Well, they have these interesting statements where the think tank will actually go back and study what happened and kind of report back, whether, what were the actual outcomes of things. And I had raised probably about 10 years ago, I had raised the idea of us trying to implement something like that, kind of an LSA kind of think tank thing. And I couldn't get anybody to bite on that. But I think that we'd really benefit from that, some kind of objective analytical analysis of what the actual impacts are of laws passed by the legislature. That would really be helpful, but we're just not very good at looking back.
All right, well, I have a question on SB 450, Article 5 convention. Plan, the pros, the cons. Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think this is kind of what we call message bills. They're not really intended to do anything, but they send messages. And, I wouldn't be surprised if it gets passed. I mean, the basic argument is that because Congress won't return power to the states or do term limits for members of Congress or whatever kind of the agenda is for people, the idea is that they want to use this provision in the Constitution that allows the states to call for a constitutional convention. The thing that I think gives people pause is it's really unclear whether once the convention is convened, whether it can become a runaway train. And now they can, do all kinds of crazy, who needs a First Amendment, or let's give the president more power, or, let's do some pretty radical changes in our system. So, I've always voted against those because I'm not interested in taking that risk. Now, they tried out people saying, well, no, you can limit it and there's ways you can do it. And it's just interesting that I think, and this is not the first time this has passed. And these things have been coming up for at least 20 years and just like on a regular cycle. And I think that one year I remember the way they would address this thing, like, well, what if the delegates get out there and they just start going crazy and start changing all these things up? They said, well, we'll make it like a misdemeanor if they vote, beyond the authority they're given by the state or something. So I think it's a message for people that are dissatisfied with the federal government and they want to just send a message that, yeah, we would do something about it.
All right, Senator, anything on that?
No, I think that's pretty much where I am and what we heard on the floor, passed anyway. And I will, today I just opened my mail this morning. I had another letter on term limits. I mean, it's an organized group, but it's interesting. This session in the Senate, we spent a lot of time dictating sort of the term limits of Congress and dictating how local governments should spend money or not receive money, or with property taxes. But whether or not we clean our own house, that's a whole different story. But it's just interesting. We're having this conversation on term limits for Congress and what local governments can do with property taxes and spending those dollars, or school boards, but never senators. That's my 2 cents.
That debate's been going on as long as I can remember these term limit debates. We don't have any questions from any of our attendees. So if you have one more, we're wrapping up. I just had one on another Chamber of Commerce question. Bear with me. We had the tax task force, and I think they released something last December, November. Did anything come of that? I think we're always looking, or at least hoping, that when we pass legislation, that we're looking kind of holistically and kind of thinking these things through. Anything come out of that, or anything, or any debates on just where we're going as far as sort of diversifying our revenue sources and looking here in the long term?
Thank you, Christopher, for asking this question because this one is there was so much attention given to this. Was called SALT. And I have since realized that it was just a front to say we're doing something without actually ever doing something, because for 2 years leading up to that report, any tax credit or anything that had to do with taxes, we were told, we're not going to deal with that until we adjourn this SALT committee to make recommendations. And so you just kick the can down the road, and then they make recommendations, and we're not really addressing much other than SB1 was something that came out of that. That's frustrating. But no, I mean, there was no big real, here is how we're going to implement a tax structure that's better for Indiana as a result of what we learned from this 2-year task force. So I haven't heard much discussion about real changes for Indiana outside of Senate Bill 1.
Yeah, that's not a big, that's sort of looking at a small portion of it. Representative Pierce, do you have anything to add on that before I go?
Yeah, I was just trying to look at their webpage here, and I think technically it expires on June 30th of this year. So because I'm trying to see what I don't remember getting a final report from them. I mean, the thing that's interesting about it is so that task force started out as the idea was it was going to create a pathway for the state income tax to be completely eliminated, right? Which would mean that you'd have to replace it with some other kind of tax unless you just literally didn't do anything in government. And I think that what happened is, like, in very short order, like after the first meeting, they figured out, like, there's no way to eliminate the state income tax that's least politically palatable to people. And so it ended up kind of being more of just like an academic exercise to let all these experts come in, and particularly legislative services, to explain like all the minutia of the various taxes that exist in the state and kind of how they're raised and where they go. So maybe there was some value to kind of getting that deep dive on the Indiana tax system. But I think it was really just more about getting people's hopes up and about we wouldn't have to pay income taxes anymore. And it's not mentioned anymore at all, which is interesting to me if it's still technically functioning.
I'm going to ask one more. Last year they had the public health was the big topic, and then funding and empowering county health departments. Where are we at with that a year later? What have you been hearing from any other counties? Some success stories or anything that of note?
Yeah, thank you, Christopher. That's good. That measure has increased some really important initiatives in counties that were struggling. One of them is the way that we've been able to test more for lead, especially in up to the age of 3. But school-age children, lead testing has increased significantly because of that funding. We've been able to do more, counties have been able to do more with smoking cessation. The unique thing about that bill and the funding was the State Board of Health was going to work individually with counties to identify what are the health measures that we need to focus on here versus just a blanket approach that every local health department would have to do the same with the funding that they received. And it was very individualized. So that was good. And the current commissioner did a good job of saying this is, some serious positive impacts. And one of those most positive was in lead testing and some help to counties that needed it. Unfortunately, it's definitely on the chopping block in 1001, and we're having to make sure that that funding continues. But the Senate Bill 2, in decreasing Medicaid funding for our Healthy Indiana plan, one of the reasons why we can arbitrarily put a cap on the number of individuals who will qualify for the Healthy Indiana plan was because, well, look, we are spending all this money on public health, and that should make a difference. Spending money on public health is different than somebody needing access to health care and be on the Healthy Indiana plan. But that was kind of if we're going to support public health departments, then we should be able to decrease the amount of money that we're spending in Medicaid. And I think that's apples to oranges, and take issue with that kind of argument. But it is making a difference. And local health departments are seeing that they are able to address some of the serious issues that their counties were seeing. And right now, when we first passed this bill, not every county wanted to participate, but now we have 100% participation in that program. So I think that's a win for Indiana. Look at that, bipartisan. That's a win for Indiana.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been some fairly good reports coming back, and it's a very young program. But here, this illustrates everything that's wrong with the legislature. This whole thing, right? So, first of all, for decades and decades, we underfunded public health. I mean, you're like on the ranking state really low. To Governor Holcomb's credit, when he was in office, he decided to make this a priority, and he knew it'd be a heavy lift, particularly coming out of COVID, because a lot of people had turned their frustrations and animosities about the whole pandemic thing at their local health departments who were attempting to manage that pandemic. So he brought in former Senator Ken Lee, who used to run the Appropriations Committee, and we had special meetings, and they really worked it hard. And they made it voluntary for the counties to join so they could kind of take a little bit of the conspiracy edge off of the opponents. And I think that the governor said that he would like to have $300 million put in the program, to get it going. At the end of that budget cycle, they did 150 million, and they said, it's going to take a while for the states to gear up, and they can't absorb all the money right away. So we'll get to the full amount later. And now the budget comes out of the House, and I think it went down to 100 million or something. It's been cut. Right. And the point that Governor Holcomb made when he was pushing it is that if you invest on the front end on these health and wellness programs, smoking cessation, and all of that kind of stuff, we will have a healthier population. That's what will bring down our Medicaid costs. If you lower diabetes, lung cancer, all this kind of stuff, you can really save money for the state. And then on top of it, the employers will have a more productive workforce. Maybe their healthcare premiums will go down because they have a healthier workforce. Their rating will be better. So that money could really, the benefit of that money could multiply, I don't know how many fold. But instead, it's just like, oh, well, that was yesterday's news, and they cut it back. So who knows what will happen with the final number when it comes back out of the Senate or conference committee. But that really, to me, is kind of Indiana and the legislature in a nutshell. That something can have a lot of benefits, but you're not willing to invest in it, which, by the way, you're saying that at the same time, you're cutting the income tax in the next 2 years down to 2.9% from 3%. It was 3.4 years back, and they've been cutting it ever since. And we have $180 million that we can put into subsidizing the wealthiest families in the state to have private education through vouchers. So we can find money for that kind of stuff, but we can't find money for public health. And it's kind of infuriating.
Hey, Representatives, we're wrapping up. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Final thoughts, get your crystal ball out as we head to the home stretch of the General Assembly here.
Whose crystal ball is going first?
I have, so Senate Bill 1 and Senate Bill 518, those were heard in committees as testimony only. I have not seen the agenda for Ways and Means for the House. Maybe I see Representative Pierce is looking online to see if it's been put on there. So I'm aware that the senators on the Senate passed through both of those bills with very little fiscal analysis on either. And both are tied together. You really can't vote on one without knowing the impact of the other. So I'm curious about those two bills, if what's going to happen to those and where they will end up. I anticipate Senate Bill 2 will probably become some part of either 1003, I think, is the House, whatever is happening with the House priority on funding. But I think they're different, but I think Senate Bill 2 will probably pass. Interestingly, though, met with the governor's office this past week, and on the floor of the Senate for Senate Bill 2, which is the capping of Medicaid recipients on participating in HIP, the governor's office is saying that Senate Bill 2 will never pass. Well, will never pass because of the federal stipulations on Medicaid spending. So Senate Bill 2 is kind of dead on arrival because it will never pass federally. The argument for Senate Bill 2 on the Senate floor was the federal government is demanding that we pass Senate Bill 2. So I think what we're seeing is, and maybe that's my ending comments, is we've got kind of the fight once again between the governor's office and state house Republicans that is going to be playing out, whether that's Senate Bill 1 on property taxes or Medicaid funding. And that is going to be an interesting and important fight to watch play out. And I would say don't ease up on letting your legislators know where you stand with bills. But with that, I'm not sure how things are going to end up, but continue to remain vigilant. And I am continuing to remain very, very concerned about where we're heading as a state, and appreciate so much hearing from all of you. Thank you.
You, Senator?
Yeah, so Senate Bill 1, a bill like that, it's interesting because I think it's going to take some time for them to kind of sort through what's actually going to work. And so I think they're just kind of floating trial balloons right now. So Senate Bill 1 is on the calendar again in the Ways and Means Committee. And let's see, when are they scheduled to meet? So this is Wednesday, March 12 at 1:30 p.m. up in room 404. But the interesting thing is it says that they're going to have a hearing only on the committee amendment. So they're going to not vote on anything, but the amendment is going to be the same as the introduced version of HB 1402, which I would have to go back and look at that again, remind myself what it is. And it said it's for discussion purposes only. So I think that Senator Thompson's has a little more sensitive to like local government having to do their jobs. So I think he's a little bit more concerned about how do you make this work. But he's got the governor saying like, I want the big rollback. I want the big home run here. And so I think they're probably flailing around. So it looks like next week's focus will be picking apart and discussing 1402 to see if somehow that could become the new SB1 and somehow balance this desire to maximize property tax relief while at the same time, not completely hobbling local government. So we'll have to see how that works. So I think another week of wheel spinning on SB1 is probably what we're going to see.
Thank you, Representative Pierce, and thank both of you for being here this morning. Let's pop up slide 4 as we close out the ceremony. Just encourage our attendees to stay active, contact your legislators on issues that you care about, and the General Assembly website can give you all the updates on many of the bills and more that we talked about today. We have one more legislative update that the League of Women are going to put on. That it's going to be Saturday, April 19th, same 9:30 start time. Again, thank you to our legislators. Thank all of you for attending today, making your part of your Saturday morning and joining us. So just a couple thanks. CATS TV, the Community Action Television. Our team members, our sponsors, the League of Women Voters, Bloomington, Monroe County, Brown County, Johnson County. My organization, the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, the NAACP Monroe County branch, and finally the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Columbus, Indiana. Thank you for your time today, and we will see you in April. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your Saturday.